It all started on a Tuesday. And not just any Tuesday, but one of those perfect early fall Tuesdays that advertisers use to sell you pickup trucks and pumpkin spice lattes. The air was crisp, the sky was an obnoxious shade of blue, and a gentle breeze was rustling the leaves of the maple trees that gave our subdivision the idyllically named Maple Creek Estates its moniker. I was standing on my front porch, nursing a mug of coffee that was just the right side of scalding and admiring my own truck. She wasn't a brand new, fresh-off-the-lot behemoth, but she was mine. A respectable 5-year-old Ford F-150 paid in full. The color was a deep, metallic gray that looked damn good in the morning sun. It was parked on the street, directly in front of my house. Perfectly legal. Not blocking a hydrant. Not too close to the corner. Just parked. It was a scene of such profound, boring, suburban tranquility that you just knew something was about to come along and drop a steaming pile of chaos right in the middle of it. I took a sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest. Life was good. I'd managed to escape the cubicle farm a few years back, and now worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant my daily commute was a 10-step journey from my bed to my desk. I owned my house, I had no debt besides a mortgage that was more manageable than my caffeine addiction, and my biggest problem that morning was whether to have a sandwich or leftover pizza for lunch. That's when I saw it. A flash of neon pink tucked aggressively under the driver's side windshield wiper of my truck. It was so out of place in the muted, HOA-approved color palette of the neighborhood, the beiges, the taupes, the slightly different beiges, that it might as well have been a tiny, rectangular alien spacecraft. My peaceful coffee-sipping moment evaporated. I put the mug down, a sense of weary dread already settling in my stomach. I knew what this was. I had been blessedly free of the HOA's direct attention for the 2 years I'd lived here, but I knew my luck had just run out. I walked down the driveway, the concrete still cool under my bare feet. As I plucked the paper from under the wiper, I glanced across the street, and there she was. Brenda. Brenda was the self-appointed queen of Maple Creek Estates, the president of the HOA, and a woman who seemed to be powered by the joy she derived from the minor suffering of others. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair that looked like it could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, and she was currently pretending to be intensely focused on watering a row of petunias that were so uniform they looked like they'd been printed out. Her watering was just an excuse, of course. She was watching me. I could feel the laser beams of her judgment from 50 feet away. She gave me a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a predator who has just successfully cornered a particularly plump field mouse. I unfolded the pink slip. The black, all-caps letters screamed at me. Homeowners Association violation notice. My eyes scanned the details. Violator, Leo Garcia, 112 Maple Lane. Violation, improperly parked vehicle in public thoroughfare. Section 7, subsection B. Fine, $50. I read it twice. Public thoroughfare. The keyword being public, as in belonging to the public, as in not belonging to her. A slow burn started in my chest. This wasn't just a ticket. It was an affront to the very concept of logic. I looked at my truck, then at the street, then back at the ticket. Nope. Nothing about this made sense. I decided to nip this in the bud. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. A simple conversation would clear it right up. With the misplaced optimism of a man about to willingly walk into a lion's den, I crossed the street. "Hey, Brenda," I began, holding up the pink slip like a peace offering. "Morning. I think there's been a bit of a mix-up here. I got this ticket for parking on the street, but, well, this is a public street, right? The city plows it and everything." Brenda turned off her hose with a deliberate twist of the nozzle. She looked at me, her head tilted with a look of practiced pity, the kind a doctor gives you before delivering some very bad news about a rash. "Oh, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I know it can be a little confusing for new residents. I had lived here for 2 years. You see, when you purchased your lovely home, you agreed to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She said the full name like it was a sacred text. "The CC&Rs, as we call them, clearly state that for the visual harmony of the community, all vehicles must be parked in a designated driveway or garage." I blinked. "Visual harmony?" "Brenda, it's a truck. It's not a flaming pile of tires. It's just parked." "Yes," she said slowly, as if explaining gravity to a caveman. "But while the street may be functionally public, it falls under the aesthetic and regulatory purview of the association. Imagine if everyone did it, the clutter. The streetscape would be completely ruined. We can't have large, unsightly work vehicles lining our beautiful lanes." My truck was a personal vehicle I used for camping trips and the occasional haul from Home Depot. The only work it did was transporting me to the grocery store. Unsightly? It's a 2020 F-150. It's probably nicer than half the cars in this neighborhood. Her smile tightened. "That's a matter of opinion. The rule is the rule. It's for the benefit of everyone's property values." She gestured vaguely at the row of identical houses. "We all have to do our part." The conversation was going nowhere. It was like arguing with a brick wall if the brick wall could fine you $50. My internal monologue, however, was having a field day. Aesthetic purview? Does your beige soul get offended by the sight of rubber and steel? Is this some kind of vehicular feng shui I'm not aware of? "So, what am I supposed to do?" I asked, trying to keep the sarcasm from leaking into my voice. "My girlfriend is visiting this weekend. Where does she park?" "There's guest parking by the community pool," she said brightly. "It's only a 10-minute walk." A 10-minute walk. In a subdivision designed for cars. The absurdity was breathtaking. "Right," I said, the veneer of my politeness cracking. "Well, I think this is a mistake, so I'm not going to be paying it." Brenda's chipper facade dropped, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. "You can certainly appeal, Leo," she said, her voice now flat and hard. "The Architectural and Environmental Control Committee meets on the first Wednesday of every month in my garage, 7 p.m. sharp. But I'll tell you now, the committee takes a very dim view of violations of Section 7. She turned back to her petunias, the conversation officially over. I stood there for a moment, the ridiculous pink paper crinkling in my fist. It wasn't about the $50 anymore. Oh no, it was about the principle. It was about the smug, self-satisfied look on her face. It was about the phrase, aesthetic purview. I walked back to my house, a plan already forming in my mind. A petty, ill-advised, and glorious plan. I was going to fight this. I was going to go to that meeting, armed with logic and reason, and I was going to win. I was so young then, so naive. That night, after a dinner of reheated pizza that tasted like defeat, I decided it was time to arm myself for the coming battle. If I was going to face down Brenda and her committee of beige-loving sycophants, I needed to know the enemy. And the enemy was a 3-inch thick white binder sitting on a shelf in my office, ominously labeled Maple Creek Estates, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I had received it at my closing. A hefty tome of legalese that my realtor had brushed off as standard HOA stuff. Just don't paint your house purple. Ha ha ha. I had promptly put it on the shelf and forgotten about it, assuming it was filled with boring but reasonable guidelines. Tonight, I was diving in. I cracked open a beer, settled into my office chair, and opened the binder. The first page was a flowery mission statement about preserving the natural beauty and harmonious character of the community. It was all downhill from there. It wasn't just a set of rules, it was a manifesto for a cult of conformity, a detailed instruction manual on how to surgically remove all traces of personality from your own property. For 2 hours, I read, my initial determination slowly morphing into a cocktail of disbelief and morbid fascination. I started taking notes, partly for my appeal, and partly because I was convinced no one would believe me if I didn't have proof. The list of absurdities grew longer and longer. Holiday decorations. All exterior holiday-themed decorations, including but not limited to lighting, wreaths, and inflatable figures, may not be erected more than 14 days prior to the federally recognized date of said holiday. All such decorations must be fully removed within 48 hours of the conclusion of said holiday. I imagined a team of HOA commandos doing a sweep on December 27th, issuing fines for any lingering Santas. Flora and fauna. The color of all exterior flower pots, planters, and containment vessels must be chosen from the pre-approved community palette, available in Appendix C. I flipped to Appendix C. The palette consisted of terracotta, taupe, and a thrilling shade called greige. There was also a detailed list of approved shrubbery. God forbid you plant an unapproved azalea. Recreational equipment. No basketball hoops, whether permanent or portable, may be visible from the street. My internal note for this one was simple. The children must remain joyless. Their laughter displeases the beige overlords. Garbage receptacles. Waste and recycling receptacles may not be placed curbside prior to 6 p.m. on the evening before scheduled collection, and must be returned to a non-visible storage location, that is, garage or approved enclosure, no later than 9 a.m. on the day of collection. I did the math. My trash cans were allowed a public appearance of exactly 15 hours per week. Any longer, and they would presumably cause irreparable harm to the visual harmony. Gnomes. I swear I am not making this up. Section 12, subsection D. All decorative lawn statuary, including gnomes, flamingos, and other representations of fauna, must not exceed 18 inches in height, and must be placed in a manner that is not visually obtrusive. There was a footnote clarifying that visually obtrusive was at the sole discretion of the committee. It was a masterpiece of micromanagement. I imagined the committee meetings where these rules were born. A shadowy room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. "Okay, team," a Brenda-like figure would say. "Our Q3 fine revenue is down. We need a new infraction. Johnson, what have you got?" A timid man in the corner would raise his hand. We could mandate that all garden gnomes must face magnetic north?" And the room would erupt in applause. "Brilliant, Johnson, a true visionary." Finally, deep within the document, I found it. Section 7, subsection B. It was just as she'd said, a vaguely worded sentence about vehicles needing to be in driveways or garages to prevent a cluttered appearance. There was no mention of public versus private roads. It was a classic piece of legal gray area, designed to be wielded like a club against anyone who stepped out of line. I needed professional help. I picked up my phone and called my best friend Dave. Dave was a lawyer. He wasn't a fire-breathing litigator. He was a corporate lawyer who spent his days reviewing software licensing agreements, but he knew the law. "Leo, it's 10 o'clock. Is your Wi-Fi down again?" he answered, sounding tired. "Worse," I said. "I've fallen down the HOA rabbit hole." I explained the situation. The truck, the pink slip, Brenda's sermon on aesthetic purview. I then read him the rule from the binder. He was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sigh I knew all too well. It was his You've gotten yourself into something stupid, haven't you? Sigh. Okay, he said. Legally, you're almost certainly in the right. An HOA's covenants can't supersede municipal or county law. If it's a public street, it's a public street. They can't legally fine you or have you towed for parking there. Yes, I pumped a fist in the air. I knew it. But, he continued, and it was a very large but, legally right and HOA right are two different universes. These people live in a bubble of their own creation. They have their own government, their own laws, their own kangaroo court. You can fight them, and you might even win in actual court eventually, but it'll cost you thousands in legal fees and months of your life. They have a war chest funded by everyone's dues, and their lawyer is probably some retired pit bull who lives for this stuff. So what are you saying? I asked, my triumphant mood deflating. I'm saying, Dave said, his voice laced with the grim practicality I both valued and hated, that you should just pay the $50, man. I'm serious, it's not worth it. You can't fight City Hall, especially when City Hall is a 50-something woman with a label maker and way too much time on her hands. Consider it a stupidity tax and move on. I hung up the phone, feeling dejected. He was right, of course. The logical, sensible part of my brain knew he was right. But the other part of my brain, the stubborn, spiteful part that was currently picturing Brenda's smug face, couldn't let it go. Paying the fine would be admitting she was right. It would be validating her entire insane system of rules. It would be bending the knee to the beige dictator. No, I couldn't do it. I looked at the binder, then at my notes. Dave had given me the logical path, but I wasn't feeling logical. I was feeling righteous. I closed the binder, the plastic cover making a satisfying thump. The meeting was in a week. I would go. I would present my case. Reason and justice would prevail. Brenda and her committee would see the error of their ways and rescind the fine. It would be like a scene out of a feel-good movie. I drained my beer, filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I was David, and Brenda was my beige, passive-aggressive Goliath. And I had a slingshot full of pure, unadulterated facts. What could possibly go wrong? The first Wednesday of the month arrived with all the pleasant anticipation of a root canal. All week, I had meticulously prepared my case. I had printouts from the city's public works website, clearly marking Maple Lane as a city-maintained public road. I had highlighted the relevant section of the county property map. I even had a short, polite, and devastatingly logical speech prepared. I was ready. At 6:55 p.m., I walked across the street to Brenda's house. The Architectural and Environmental Control Committee meeting was, as promised, being held in her garage. And it was exactly as I'd pictured. The garage was so clean you could have performed surgery on the floor. There were no oil stains, no stray tools, just neatly organized shelves of gardening supplies and Christmas decorations stored in color-coordinated bins. In the center, under the cold, fluorescent glare of the overhead lights, was a folding card table. Brenda sat at the head of the table, looking regal. To her right sat a woman who must have been at least 80, with a cloud of white hair and a pair of knitting needles that clicked with a steady, metronomic rhythm. She didn't look up when I entered. To Brenda's left sat a man in his 60s with a severe side part and a pained expression, as if he was constantly smelling something unpleasant. This was Gary, the retired insurance adjuster. He was the committee's vice president, which I assumed meant his primary duty was to nod in agreement with whatever Brenda said. "Leo, you're prompt. Have a seat," Brenda said, gesturing to a lone folding chair set up opposite them. It felt less like a neighborly meeting and more like an interrogation. There was a plate of store-bought oatmeal raisin cookies on the table, untouched. They looked dry enough to be used as building materials. "Thanks for seeing me," I said, sitting down and arranging my documents on the table in front of me. I'm here to appeal the parking violation I received last week." Brenda smiled, that serene, infuriating smile. "Of course. The committee is always willing to listen to the concerns of our residents. The floor is yours." I took a deep breath and launched into my prepared speech. I was calm, I was respectful, I was overwhelmingly reasonable. "As you know, I was fined for parking my truck on Maple Lane," I began. "And while I understand and appreciate the HOA's commitment to maintaining a beautiful neighborhood, I believe this fine was issued in error. The core of my appeal is simple. Maple Lane is a public street, not private property belonging to the association." I slid the city website printout across the table. "This is from the city's Department of Public Works. As you can see, Maple Lane is listed as a municipal road, maintained and serviced by city taxes. The HOA's covenants, while binding on our private properties, cannot legally extend to dictate the use of public thoroughfares." Gary, the insurance adjuster, picked up the paper, glanced at it for a second, and then looked at Brenda, as if for instructions on how to interpret it. The knitter kept knitting. I continued, pressing my advantage. "Essentially, fining a resident for legally parking on a public street is an overreach of the HOA's authority. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just believe the rule is being misapplied in this case. Therefore, I respectfully request that the committee rescind the fine." I finished, feeling pretty good about it. My argument was airtight. It was based on facts, on law, on the very definition of the word public. I had presented it calmly and without emotion. I sat back, expecting a thoughtful discussion, maybe even an apology. What I got was silence. The only sound was the rhythmic click-clack of the knitting needles. Brenda let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic moment, her eyes fixed on me. She hadn't even looked at my evidence. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you for your very passionate presentation, Leo," she said, the word passionate sounding like an insult. "The committee appreciates you taking the time to share your perspective." She folded her hands on the table. "However, your argument misses the fundamental point of the covenants. It's not about legal ownership of the asphalt. It's about a shared commitment to a standard of living. When you signed the CC and Rs, you entered into a contract with your neighbors. A contract to uphold the aesthetic integrity of Maple Creek Estates." This was going off the rails fast. "Aesthetic integrity? Brenda, it's a parking spot. We're not talking about me painting my house with polka dots." "The principle is the same," she countered, her voice smooth as silk. "One truck today, two tomorrow. Then someone decides to park their RV. Then a boat. Before you know it, our beautiful, harmonious streetscape looks like a storage lot. It erodes property values for everyone. The rule exists to prevent that slippery slope." I stared at her, dumbfounded. She hadn't addressed a single one of my points. She had just steamrolled right over them with her own bizarre, parallel logic. "But you can't enforce rules on property you don't own," I insisted, my voice rising slightly. "That's not how laws work." "We are not the law, Leo," she said, a hint of steel in her tone. "We are a community, and the community has agreed to abide by these standards." She glanced at Gary, who nodded vigorously. She then glanced at the knitter, who, without missing a stitch, muttered, "The standards are the standards." It was the first thing she'd said all night. It was also the most useless. Brenda gave me a final, pitying look. "The committee has reviewed your appeal, and we've decided to uphold the violation. In fact, since the original payment date has passed, the fine has now escalated to $100, as per the collection schedule in Appendix F." My jaw dropped. Not only had I lost, but my punishment had doubled for daring to question her authority. I looked at Gary, who was avoiding my gaze and suddenly fascinated by a spot on the ceiling. I looked at the knitter, who was now examining her work with a critical eye. I was defeated. I gathered my papers, my carefully prepared evidence, now just a stack of useless pulp. "This is unbelievable," I muttered. "The check can be made out to the Maple Creek Estates HOA," Brenda said, her cheerful tone returning now that the unpleasantness was over. "You can drop it in the secure lockbox by the pool house. Have a wonderful evening, Leo." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. My mind was racing. My logical, reasonable approach had been an unmitigated disaster. I had walked into the Star Chamber and been summarily executed. I had played by the rules, and the rules had been used to beat me over the head. As I walked out of the garage and into the cool night air, the humiliation felt hot on my cheeks. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. My polite, law-abiding strategy had failed. It was time for a new one. If Brenda wasn't going to listen to reason, maybe she'd listen to something else. For the next few days, I was locked in a cold war with Brenda. I paid the $100 fine, but I did it in the most obnoxious way I could think of. I went to the bank and got it all in rolls of pennies. I dropped the heavy, clanking bag into the HOA lockbox with a satisfying thud. It was a small, petty victory, but it was mine. More importantly, I continued to park my truck on the street. It was no longer about convenience, it was a silent, daily protest. Every morning, I'd pull my truck out of the garage and park it in the exact same spot on the curb. Every morning I'd see Brenda watching from her window, her face a thundercloud. And every day, like clockwork, a new pink slip would appear on my windshield. They were starting to accumulate on my kitchen counter like a pile of blush-colored dead leaves. I was documenting her harassment, building a case for something. I wasn't sure what yet. I knew she would escalate. I just didn't know how. The answer came on a Friday afternoon. I was in my office, trying to nail down a color palette for a new client's branding project, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door shutting with authority. I glanced out the window, and my heart did a little tap dance of anxiety against my ribs. A police car, its blue and red lights thankfully dormant, was parked directly behind my F-150. 2 officers were getting out. One was older, with a weary-looking mustache and a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had seen it all and was deeply unimpressed by most of it. The other was young, lean, with a fresh-out-of-the-academy haircut and an eagerness that radiated off him in waves. This had to be Brenda's doing. She'd called the cops on me. I saw her on her porch across the street, arms crossed, wearing a triumphant smirk that I wanted to scrape off her face with a rusty trowel. This was it. The public humiliation she'd been waiting for. I took a deep breath, told myself to stay calm, and walked outside to meet them. "Afternoon, officers," I said, trying to sound like a friendly, law-abiding citizen, and not a man whose blood pressure was currently skyrocketing. The younger cop, Officer Schmidt, stepped forward, his hand hovering near his belt. He was all business. "Good afternoon, sir. Are you the owner of this Ford F-150? "I am," I said. "Is there a problem?" "Sir, we received a call about a vehicle that's been illegally parked here for several days," Schmidt said, his eyes scanning my truck as if looking for hidden contraband. The complainant stated that it's in violation of local ordinances. From her porch, Brenda was practically vibrating with glee. This is where my research was going to pay off. "Which ordinance would that be, officer?" I asked politely. Schmidt was taken aback. The illegal parking ordinance?" The older cop, whose name tag read Miller, sighed audibly. It was the sigh of a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world right now, preferably somewhere with a fishing pole and a cold beer. "Son," Miller said to me, his voice a gravelly monotone, "lady across the street says you're not allowed to park here. That's Brenda, I said. She's the HOA president. She seems to think her HOA rules apply to a public street. Miller's eyes flickered over to Brenda, then back to me. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps shared suffering, passed between us. He'd dealt with her type before. Is this a public street? Miller asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. Yes, sir, I said. Maintained by the city. I'm not blocking a driveway. I'm not near a fire hydrant. I'm more than 20 feet from the crosswalk. I'm legally parked. Schmidt, ever the rookie, pulled out his little notepad. But the complainant cited an HOA violation. Miller put a hand on his partner's arm, stopping him. He turned his body slightly, addressing Brenda on her porch in a voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. Ma'am, is this a public road? Brenda's smug expression faltered. Well, yes, but the homeowners association. Miller cut her off with a wave of his hand. Then he can park here, he said, his voice flat and final. This is a civil matter between you and your association. It is not a police issue. He then turned to Schmidt. We're done here? To Brenda, he added, Ma'am, please do not use the non-emergency line for HOA disputes again. It ties up resources. The color drained from Brenda's face. This was not how her glorious public shaming was supposed to go. She looked like she had just swallowed a bug. Miller gave me a long, weary look. It was a look that said, I know exactly what you're dealing with, and you have my sympathies, but for the love of God, don't make me come back here. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, then got back in the patrol car. Schmidt, looking confused and disappointed that no arrests were made, followed him. As they drove away, I was filled with a glorious, intoxicating sense of victory. I had faced down the law, and the law had sided with me. I looked over at Brenda. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. I couldn't resist. I gave her my biggest, most cheerful, and most insincere wave. Have a great day, Brenda, I called out. She stared at me for a second, then turned on her heel and slammed her front door so hard I swear I saw a potted fern on her porch tremble. I walked back into my house grinning like an idiot. I had won the battle. I had humiliated her in front of the very authority she had tried to use against me. But as I watched her silhouette pacing furiously behind her living room curtains, I knew this was far from over. I hadn't just poked the beige bear, I had kicked it squarely in the snout. And a cornered, humiliated bear is the most dangerous kind of all. The war of petty annoyances was about to begin in earnest. My victory with the police had a predictable effect on Brenda. It didn't make her back down. It made her double down. If she couldn't get me on the one big, obvious thing, she was going to get me on 1,000 tiny, insignificant ones. My life became a gauntlet of pink slips and passive-aggressive notices. A new one appeared on my door almost daily, each one more ridiculous than the last. I was no longer just a resident. I was her full-time hobby. The first salvo came 2 days after the police incident. A pink slip was taped to my front door. The violation? Lawn height non-compliance. Section 4, subsection C. According to Brenda, who had apparently come onto my property with a ruler, my grass was a full 1/4 inch taller than the 3-inch maximum stipulated in the CC and Rs. The fine was $25. My internal monologue went into overdrive. 1/4 of an inch? Is she out here with a golf green mower and a micrometer? Does she not understand the basic principles of photosynthesis? The grass needs sunlight, Brenda. It has dreams, aspirations. I called Dave. She got me for my grass being too tall. How tall? He asked. 3 1/4 inches. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sound that was half sigh, half laugh. Leo, I'm a corporate attorney. I deal with multi-million-dollar intellectual property disputes. Please don't make me bill you for a consultation on lawn care. He paused again. But seriously, just mow your damn lawn. Don't give her the ammunition." He was right. So that Saturday, I gave her exactly what she wanted, but on my own terms. At precisely 7:01 a.m., 1 minute after the noise ordinance lifted for the weekend, I fired up my gas-powered lawnmower. It wasn't a quiet machine. It roared to life with the sound of a small, angry aircraft. I then proceeded to mow my lawn in the most meticulous, time-consuming pattern imaginable. I did stripes. Then I did diagonal stripes. Then I did a checkerboard pattern. It took me nearly 2 hours. I saw her curtains twitch at least a dozen times. When I was done, my lawn looked like the outfield at a Major League Baseball stadium, and every blade of grass was in perfect, cowering compliance. The next violation was from my trash cans. On Tuesday, I had apparently left them at the curb until 9:10 a.m., a full 10 minutes past the mandated retrieval time, another $25 fine. My response was to go to Home Depot and buy the ugliest, most garishly colored trash can I could find. It was a violent shade of safety yellow that screamed for attention. It was, however, technically compliant with the size regulations. The following Tuesday, I wheeled that neon monstrosity to the curb. It stuck out from the row of uniform black and gray cans like a sore thumb. A beautiful, rebellious, plastic sore thumb. I made sure to wheel it back in at exactly 8:59 a.m. The war escalated. I received a notice for a minor oil stain on my driveway, which was about the size of a quarter. I went out with a bottle of industrial-grade degreaser and scrubbed the spot until the concrete was several shades lighter than the surrounding area, creating a clean stain that was arguably more noticeable. She sent me a violation for an unapproved welcome mat. My old one just said, "Welcome." Apparently, the font was too whimsical. I retaliated by ordering a new one online. It was a plain black mat, but in the smallest, most boring Helvetica font imaginable, it read, "Go away." It was technically just a statement, not a command directed at anyone in particular. It stayed. My favorite, though, was the pumpkin incident. It was the first week of November. I had a single, sad-looking pumpkin left over from Halloween sitting on my porch. It wasn't rotting or anything. I had just forgotten about it. Sure enough, a pink slip appeared. Failure to remove holiday decorations in a timely manner. Section 11, subsection A. This was the point where I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I was living under a microscope. I started noticing Brenda's car driving by my house at odd hours. I felt like every move I made was being watched, judged, and documented. My home, my one place of sanctuary, had become the front line in a bizarre, silent war. My friend Dave was getting tired of my calls. "Dude, you have to move," he said during my pumpkin-related complaint call. "Or you have to burn the whole place down. There is no middle ground." "I'm not letting her win," I grumbled. "Win? Leo, this isn't a game. There's no trophy at the end of this. It's just two grown adults wasting their lives on a series of increasingly petty squabbles. You've poked the beige bear, and now it's trying to maul you with laminated notices. You need an exit strategy." I knew he was right. The constant stress was getting to me. I was becoming as obsessed as she was. I was checking my front door for new violations like a kid checking for presents on Christmas morning. This couldn't go on forever. I needed a way out. I needed a final move, a checkmate that would end the game for good. But I had no idea what that could be. The answer, as it turned out, wasn't going to come from a lawyer or a binder full of rules. It was going to come from a man named Sal, a leaky fence, and a very angry work van. The fence in my backyard had been mocking me for months. A single wooden panel had come loose during a summer storm, and it was now leaning at a precarious angle, a constant, wobbly testament to my procrastination. With Brenda scrutinizing my every move, I figured a non-compliant fence was probably next on her hit list. It was time to call in a professional. A friend recommended a local contractor named Sal. "He's a little rough around the edges," my friend had warned, "but he does good work and he doesn't mess around." That sounded perfect. The next afternoon, a large, slightly battered-looking work van pulled up and parked on the street in front of my house. It was a rolling advertisement for Sal's Home Repair and Renovations, complete with logos, phone numbers, and a fine patina of sawdust and drywall dust. Sal himself got out. He was a man in his late 40s, built like a refrigerator, with a gruff, no-nonsense demeanor and hands that looked like they could crush bricks. "Leo!" he boomed, striding up the driveway. "Sal, let's see this fence." I liked him immediately. He took one look at the leaning panel, poked it with a thick finger, and grunted. "Yep, rotted through, easy fix. Take me an hour, maybe 2. Got the materials in the van." He was a man of few words and decisive action. I left him to his work and went back to my office. For about an hour, the only sounds were the whine of a power drill and the occasional thud of a hammer. It was the pleasant sound of progress. Then, my doorbell rang. It wasn't the gentle chime it was supposed to be. It was an angry, insistent mashing of the button. I opened the door to find Sal standing on my porch. He was holding a familiar flash of neon pink in his hand, and he was not happy. His face, normally a neutral, weathered mask, was flushed a deep, angry red. "What the hell is this?" he roared, shaking the HOA violation notice in my face. "I'm here doing a job for you. I'm parked for 60 minutes, and some crazy lady in a beige tracksuit slaps this on my windshield. Commercial vehicle in a residential zone. What is this, Beverly Hills?" I sighed. "Welcome to my world, Sal. That would be Brenda, the HOA president. She's on a bit of a power trip." Sal was not appeased. He paced back and forth on my small porch, his work boots thudding with indignation. "Power trip? This is harassment. I'm trying to run a business here. I've got 3 other jobs to get to today. Does she expect me to park down by the pool and haul all my tools half a mile?" "That's her official recommendation, yes," I said grimly. Sal stopped pacing and jabbed a finger toward the street. "She can't do this. This is a public road. I do work for the county sometimes, paving and pothole repair. They're the ones who own this asphalt. This little club of hers doesn't own jack squat." And then it happened. A switch flipped in my brain. It was like a scene in a movie where the camera zooms in on the hero's face and everything else goes blurry. The words echoed in my mind, shimmering with possibility. County road. The county owns this asphalt. The HOA doesn't own jack squat. All this time I had been arguing with Brenda on her terms. I had been fighting about the CC and Rs, about her interpretation versus mine. I had brought in the city police, but I had been thinking too small. The city, the HOA, they were just players in the game. Sal's angry rant had just revealed who the final boss was. The county. I stared at the street, at the dull black asphalt that I had driven on 1,000 times without a second thought. It wasn't just a street anymore. It was an idea. It was a weapon. "Sal," I said slowly, my voice quiet. "What did you just say?" "I said she's a crazy lady," he fumed. "No, after that. About who owns the road." Sal looked at me, his anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by confusion. "The county," he said. "The county owns the road. They maintain it. Why?" A slow, glorious, and utterly insane idea began to bloom in the fertile soil of my spite-filled mind. It was an idea so audacious, so ridiculous that it just might work. "So, if the county owns it," I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster, "who's actually in charge of it? I mean, who would I talk to about the road itself?" Sal shrugged, still looking bewildered. "I don't know. Some pencil pusher down at the county administration building, I guess. The clerk's office, maybe? They handle all the property records and stuff. Why are you looking at me like that?" I was looking at him, with the dawning reverence one reserves for an oracle. This gruff, angry contractor had just handed me the key. He had shown me the way out of my suburban prison. I was no longer thinking about fighting Brenda over petty violations. I was thinking bigger, so much bigger. "Sal," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "You may be a genius." He just stared at me, the pink violation slip still clutched in his hand. "Right. Can you just pay this for me? I gotta fix your fence." "I'll do you one better, Sal," I said, clapping him on his broad shoulder. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else, ever again." He shook his head and went back to my fence, muttering about crazy homeowners. But I didn't care. I was already walking back into my house, my mind buzzing with the beautiful, terrible, and perfectly legal plan that was rapidly taking shape. The game was about to change. My weekend was a blur of caffeine and furious keyboard clicks. I dove into the official website for Harrison County, a digital labyrinth that looked like it had been designed in 1998 by a committee that hated joy. It was a nightmare of broken links, confusing menus, and downloadable PDFs that seemed to exist only to crash my browser. But I was a man on a mission. I was searching for the Holy Grail, a loophole. For hours, I waded through digital archives of meeting minutes and property tax codes. I found plenty of boring stuff about zoning variances and sewage easements, and then, buried deep within a sub-menu titled Public Works and Civic Engagement, I found it. It was a program called Adopt a Road. At first glance, it was exactly what it sounded like. A program for scout troops and church groups to get their picture in the local paper for picking up litter along a 1-mile stretch of highway. But I kept digging. And attached to the litter pickup program, like a forgotten appendix, was an ordinance. Ordinance 42C. It was a dusty, rarely used piece of legislation titled Temporary Lease of Public Thoroughfares for the Purposes of Civic Improvement and Beautification. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The ordinance stated that a private citizen or entity could, with the county's approval, enter into a short-term or long-term lease for a stretch of county-owned road. The lease was intended for things like community gardens on medians or large-scale art projects. The lessee would assume responsibility for the beautification and basic upkeep, and in return, the county would be absolved of that responsibility. The cost? A nominal fee to make the contract legally binding. I spent the rest of the weekend crafting my new identity. For the low price of $50, I went online and registered Leo and Associates, LLC. My associates were my cat, Mittens, and a ficus plant in my living room, but the county didn't need to know that. Having an LLC made it sound official. It made it sound like I wasn't just some guy with a grudge. On Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, I picked up the phone. I took a deep breath, channeled my inner corporate drone, and dialed the number for the Harrison County Clerk's office. The phone rang 6 times before a weary-sounding woman answered. "County Clerk's office, this is Gladys." "Good morning, Gladys," I began, my voice several octaves lower than usual, oozing professionalism. "My name is Leo Garcia. I'm the project manager for Leo and Associates, a civic development firm. I'm calling to inquire about a temporary road lease under Ordinance 42C. There was a long silence on the other end, filled with the sound of shuffling papers. Ordinance 42C, Gladys repeated slowly, as if I'd asked her about an ancient Sumerian text. Honey, are you sure you have the right number? That's usually for parades and 5K runs. I'm quite sure, Gladys, I said smoothly. My firm is planning a rather ambitious project, and the section of Maple Lane between Chestnut Avenue and Oak Street is the ideal location for our pilot program. Her interest was piqued. I could hear her tapping on a keyboard. Maple Lane. Okay, I see it. It's just a residential street. What kind of project are we talking about? This was the moment of truth. I had rehearsed my lines. It's a long-term, multi-phase community beautification and traffic flow analysis project, I said, stringing together the most boring, bureaucratic buzzwords I could think of. We'll be installing decorative planters, conducting surface durability tests, and implementing a new, streamlined parking allocation system to enhance the neighborhood's aesthetic and functional cohesion. I had no idea what any of that meant, but it sounded impressive as hell. "Oh," Gladys said, and for the first time there was a hint of excitement in her voice. "That sounds very official. And what's the proposed compensation for the county for this lease?" I paused for dramatic effect. My LLC will, of course, assume all costs for maintenance, signage, and beautification efforts for the duration of the lease. And as for compensation, we would be honored to lease the road for the symbolic fee of $1 per annum. Silence. I held my breath. I had either gone too far or I had hit the bureaucratic jackpot. $1? She finally said, a note of wonder in her voice. "So, let me get this straight. Your company wants to take over the maintenance of a public road, make it prettier, and you're going to pay us for the privilege?" "That's the essence of it, yes," I said, trying to keep from grinning. "We believe in giving back to the community." "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "No one's used this ordinance for anything but block parties in years." I could hear her smile through the phone. She was so bored with her job that my insane, vengeful quest was the most exciting thing to happen to her all decade. "All right, Mr. Garcia, I'll email you the forms. Fill them out, get them notarized, and send them back with a check for $1. Welcome to the Harrison County Civic Improvement family." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. It was working. It was actually working. I had just convinced a government official to let me take control of an entire street for the price of a gumball. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously filling out the paperwork for Leo and Associates, LLC. Under Description of Beautification Project, I wrote a full page of magnificent, meaningless jargon about synergizing the vehicular-pedestrian interface and implementing proactive pavement harmony. I got it notarized at the bank the next morning, wrote a personal check for $1, and sent the whole package off via certified mail. Now, all I had to do was wait and plan the revolution. 2 excruciatingly long weeks later, a thick manila envelope from the Harrison County Clerk's office arrived in my mailbox. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside, nestled amongst a sheaf of official-looking documents, was a single sheet of paper with a raised seal and a flourishing signature from Gladys. It was my lease agreement. It was official. For the grand sum of $1, I was now the temporary lord and master of Maple Lane. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made me dizzy. For a moment, I just stood in my kitchen, holding the paper, laughing like a mad scientist whose creation had just lurched to life. My first call was to Sal. "Sal, it's Leo Garcia, the guy with the fence and the crazy HOA lady." "Oh, yeah," he grumbled. "Did you pay that ticket? They sent me another notice." "Forget the notice, Sal," I said, my voice electric with excitement. "I have a job for you. A very unusual job. And I guarantee it'll be the funniest damn job you'll ever take. How are you with installing signs?" There was a pause. "Signs? What kind of signs?" "The best kind," I said. Under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness 2 days later, a scene of beautiful, malicious competence unfolded on Maple Lane. Sal's work van, its engine off, was parked silently at the end of the block. He wasn't alone. He had brought his nephew, a lanky kid named Marco, who looked like he'd rather be playing video games, but who knew how to handle a post-hole digger. I stood by like a general overseeing a critical operation, holding a large thermos of coffee, And the 2 signs I'd had custom-made by an online metal fabrication company. They weren't cheap, but they were worth every penny. They were thick, reflective aluminum, with crisp, professional lettering, designed to look as intimidatingly official as possible. Sal and Marco worked with quiet efficiency, digging the holes, mixing the concrete, and setting the posts at either end of the block, just past the intersections. As the sky began to lighten from black to a deep indigo, they were ready to mount the signs themselves. With a final few turns of a wrench, they were up. I stepped back to admire our handiwork. The signs were glorious. They were perfect. At the entrance to my street, a new reality had been declared in bold, white-on-blue letters. Property under private lease. Effective immediately, this roadway is leased to Leo and Associates, LLC. No unauthorized parking at any time. All others will be towed at owner's expense. For inquiries, contact Big Mike's Towing, 555-867-5309. Big Mike's Towing was, of course, a burner phone I had bought for $20 at a gas station, and it was currently sitting in my jacket pocket. Sal stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans and looking up at the sign. A slow grin spread across his face. "You're a sick man, Leo," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "A sick, beautiful man." "Just a man who reads the fine print," I replied, handing him an envelope of cash that was significantly more than he'd quoted me. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said with a chuckle. He and Marco packed up their tools and were gone before the first bird started to sing. I walked back to my house, my heart thumping a triumphant rhythm. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat down in my living room window, and waited for the sun to come up. The game board was set. The trap was laid. All I needed now was for the queen to make her move. The show started at precisely 7:28 a.m. Like clockwork, Brenda's front door opened, and she emerged, dressed in her signature beige tracksuit, to retrieve her morning newspaper from the driveway. I leaned forward in my chair, my coffee cup poised midway to my lips. This was the moment I had been dreaming of for weeks. She bent over, picked up the paper, and straightened up. For a second, nothing happened. She turned to go back inside. Then she paused. Some subconscious part of her brain must have registered that something was different, something was out of place in her perfectly controlled universe. She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping across the street. And then she saw it. The sign. I wish I had a high-definition, slow-motion camera. The sequence of expressions that washed over her face was a masterpiece of non-verbal communication. First, there was simple confusion, a slight furrowing of the brow. "What's that? A new stop sign?" Then came disbelief as she took a few steps closer, her head tilted. Her eyes narrowed as she read the words. Then came the dawning horror. Her mouth fell slightly open. The newspaper slipped from her grasp and fluttered to the lawn, forgotten. Her face, normally a healthy, if smug, pink, went completely pale. She stared at the sign as if it were an alien obelisk that had just descended from the heavens. She looked from the sign to my house, then back to the sign. Her brain was clearly struggling to process the information, to fit this impossible new reality into her rigid worldview. It wasn't computing. She spun around and looked down the other end of the block, where the second sign stood as a silent, metallic twin. Her head snapped back around. The rage started to build. It began as a flush in her cheeks, then spread across her entire face, turning it a deep, mottled red. She marched back to her house, but didn't go inside. She re-emerged a moment later, phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly at the sign as she paced back and forth on her immaculate lawn. I could almost hear the frantic conversation. "Yes, the police!" A madman has erected illegal signs and is trying to declare himself king of the street. Send everyone." After her frantic call, she seemed to come to a decision. She was going to confront the source of this madness directly. She stomped across her lawn, across the street, my street, and up my driveway. She didn't knock on my door. She hammered on it with the flat of her hand, the blows echoing through my house. I took a final, calming sip of coffee, plastered a serene smile on my face, and opened the door. "Morning, Brenda," I said cheerfully. "Lovely day, isn't it? Can I help you?" She was practically vibrating with fury. "What," she seethed through clenched teeth, "is the meaning of this? You, the signs. What have you done?" "Oh, the signs?" I feigned surprise. "Just a little civic improvement project I've undertaken. It's all perfectly above board. Per my legally binding lease agreement with Harrison County, I now control this road. It's a private leasehold. All parking, standing, and general loitering is now at the sole discretion of Leo and Associates, LLC. I smiled brightly. "Here, I made a copy of the agreement for you just in case you were curious." I handed her a crisp photocopy of the notarized lease. She snatched it from my hand and her eyes darted over the text, over the official letterhead, over Gladys's signature and the raised county seal. She looked from the paper to my face, her own a mask of utter bewilderment and hatred. "You can't do this!" she finally shrieked, the words tearing out of her throat. "Brenda, Brenda," I said, shaking my head sadly. "According to Harrison County Ordinance 42C, I absolutely can. It's my road now. We're going to be making a lot of changes. More planters, maybe a water feature. It's all about enhancing the aesthetic purview, you know." Using her own words against her was a pleasure so deep and so pure, it was almost a spiritual experience. Her eyes narrowed to slits. "Take them down now?" "I don't think so," I said. "In fact, we have our first violation to deal with." I pointed a finger past her shoulder. "Your minivan. It's currently parked on my private property without a permit." I pulled a small invoice book out of my back pocket. I'd bought it just for this occasion. I scribbled on it for a moment. "So you have two options. You can move it immediately, or you can pay the daily preferential parking fee of $75. I can take Venmo, or I can have it towed in about, 20 minutes. My friends at Big Mike's are very prompt." She just stared at me, speechless, the paper crinkling in her white-knuckled fist. The sound of a car door slamming down the street broke the standoff. The neighbors were starting to emerge, drawn by the commotion. My little coup d'etat was about to go public. The arrival of the Harrison County Police Department was a much grander affair this time. Brenda must have really laid it on thick, because it wasn't just one patrol car. It was two, 4 officers, striding towards the scene like they were responding to a bank robbery. And leading the charge, to my immense delight, were my old friends, Officer Miller and Officer Schmidt. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered. Mr. Henderson, from 2 doors down, was on his porch in his bathrobe, holding a tiny dog. The young couple across the street were peering through their blinds. The whole street was in a state of confused paralysis. They had woken up to find their world subtly but fundamentally altered. Brenda saw the police arrive and was instantly energized. This was the cavalry, here to restore order and smite the wicked, me. She rushed to meet them, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Officers, thank God you're here!" she cried, her voice cracking with melodrama. "Arrest this man! He's gone insane! He's put up these illegal signs and is trying to extort money from me. He's claiming he owns the street." Officer Miller stopped, his eyes fixing on me. His mustache seemed to droop a little further. He had a look on his face that said, "You again? Seriously?" Officer Schmidt, meanwhile, was already in full cop mode, his hand on his hip, his eyes scanning the scene for threats. Miller ambled over to me, his partner and the other 2 officers flanking him. The neighbors leaned in. This was better than cable. "Son," Miller said, his voice a low, tired rumble. "What in the Sam Hill is going on here? My dispatcher said something about a sovereign citizen declaring a new nation-state in his front yard. Please tell me that's not what's happening." "Nothing that dramatic, officer," I said calmly, holding up my hands in a gesture of peace. "Just a simple property lease dispute." "Property lease," Schmidt chimed in, stepping forward. "Sir, this is a public street. You can't lease a public street." "That's what I told him," Brenda screeched. I just smiled. "Actually, you can. It's a little-known ordinance, but it's on the books." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my trump card. The original, notarized lease agreement from the county, safe in a plastic sleeve. "Here you go, officer. Straight from the county clerk's office. Ordinance 42C. All legal and above board." Officer Miller took the document from me. He held it up, reading it carefully. Schmidt and the other officers leaned in to look. I watched Miller's face as he read. His eyebrows, which were perpetually furrowed in a state of weary cynicism, slowly began to rise. He read it once. Then he read it again, his lips moving silently. He looked from the official seal on the paper to the sign at the end of the street, then back to the paper. He then looked at Schmidt, whose jaw had gone slack. Finally, he looked at Brenda, who was waiting with breathless anticipation for him to clap me in irons. And then Officer Miller did something I will cherish for the rest of my days. He started to laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a deep, genuine belly laugh that seemed to start in his boots and erupt out of him. He threw his head back and roared, the sound echoing down the quiet suburban street. He laughed so hard he had to put a hand on the hood of my truck to steady himself. "Oh, wow," he finally gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "Oh, that's a new one. I've been a cop for 25 years. I've seen a lot of weird stuff. I have never, ever seen this." Brenda was horrified. "What are you laughing at? He's breaking the law." Miller composed himself, though he was still shaking with suppressed laughter. He handed the lease back to me. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Brenda and adopting his most formal, professional tone. "According to this legally executed and notarized document from the Harrison County government, he's not lying. It's his road." The silence that followed was absolute. The neighbors stared. Brenda's face crumpled. Schmidt looked like his entire understanding of the legal system had been shattered. His road?" Brenda stammered. "'Fraid so," Miller said, clearly enjoying himself now. "He has leased the property, which means, as of the date on this document, this is private property, and any disputes over its use are a civil matter." He savored the words, throwing them back in her face. "Now, if you'll excuse us, have a good day, Leo." He gave me a crisp tip of his cap, a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect from one veteran of the suburban wars to another. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, still chuckling to himself. The other 3 officers, looking completely bewildered, followed him. As they drove away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake, I looked at Brenda. She was defeated. The law, her ultimate weapon, had been turned against her. She was adrift in a sea of her own making, and I was the captain now. "Now," I said, pulling out my invoice book again, "about that $75 for the minivan." The fallout from what the neighborhood quickly dubbed the Maple Lane purchase was swift and chaotic. My signs had turned a quiet suburban street into a hotbed of confusion and mild panic. Where were people supposed to park when they had visitors? What about the mailman? The garbage trucks? I had, of course, already called the post office and the sanitation department to grant them official access as affiliates of Leo and Associates, LLC. The HOA was in full-blown meltdown. Their authority had been rendered completely meaningless on my block. Brenda, after a day of fuming in her house, had attempted a counterattack by sending out a furious all-caps email to the residents, decrying my illegal and hostile takeover and unneighborly power grab. But it was too late. The story was out, and frankly, it was too damn funny. Most people were on my side. Anyone who had ever received a violation for their grass being too tall or their welcome mat being too cheerful was secretly, or not so secretly, rooting for me. The HOA was forced to call an emergency meeting, not in Brenda's garage this time. This was bigger than that. They booked the auditorium at the local middle school. The email announcement was coded in urgent language about protecting the integrity of our community. The night of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. It felt like half the town was there. My neighbors, other HOA residents, even a reporter and a cameraman from the local news station who had gotten wind of the story. I sat in the front row, feeling like a man about to watch his own trial. Dave, my lawyer friend, sat next to me, having driven in from the city. He wasn't there in any official capacity. He just said he wouldn't miss this for the world, and was currently munching on a bag of popcorn. The HOA board sat at a long table on the stage, looking grim. Brenda was in the center, a sheaf of papers in front of her. She looked haggard. The past week had not been kind to her. To my surprise, there was another person on stage, a bewildered-looking woman with a name tag that read, Gladys Harrison County Clerk's Office. They had dragged my co-conspirator into this. Brenda banged a gavel, and the meeting began. She launched into a tirade, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. She painted me as a villain, a rogue agent who was destroying the neighborhood with his selfish, lawless actions. "This man," she declared, pointing a finger at me, "has held our street hostage. He is a tyrant who has used a ridiculous, obscure loophole to sow chaos and division." The crowd murmured. A few of her cronies yelled, "Hear, hear!" But most people were just watching, waiting. When she finally finished her rant, a board member opened the floor for discussion. Before anyone else could speak, I stood up. All eyes turned to me. The news camera swiveled in my direction. "I'd like to say a few words," I said, walking towards the stage. They had no choice but to let me. I stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and took a deep breath. I wasn't going to be angry. I was going to be calm, reasonable, and just a little bit funny. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "My name is Leo Garcia, though some of you may know me better as the Tyrant of Maple Lane." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. First off, I want to be clear about something. I never wanted to own a road. Frankly, it's a surprising amount of paperwork, and the liability insurance is a real headache. More laughter. The tension in the room began to ease. "I did this for one reason, and one reason only," I continued, my voice becoming more serious. "This was never about parking a truck. It was about bullying. It was about an HOA that has forgotten its fundamental purpose. An HOA is supposed to maintain property values and serve the community. It is not supposed to be the personal fiefdom of a president who fines residents for their grass being a quarter-inch too tall, or for having the wrong color flower pots, or for daring to park legally on a public street." I saw people nodding. I had them. "I tried to be reasonable," I said. "I presented my case logically at a committee meeting. My appeal was dismissed without consideration, and my fine was doubled for my trouble. I was told that the aesthetic purview of the association trumped public law. When an organization becomes that detached from reality, you have to do something dramatic to get its attention." I looked over at the board. Brenda was staring daggers at me. Gladys, the county clerk, was watching me with a look of dawning comprehension and what looked suspiciously like pride. "So here's my offer," I announced, my voice echoing in the auditorium. "I'm ready to end my tyrannical reign. I will contact the county tomorrow morning and terminate my $1 a year lease. I will give you your street back." A wave of relief went through the crowd. "But," I added, holding up a hand, "on 2 conditions." The room went silent. 1. The HOA board votes, right here, right now, to formally amend the CC and Rs. The amendment will state, in clear and unambiguous language, that the Maple Creek Estates HOA has 0 jurisdiction, regulatory or otherwise, over the use of any public county-owned roads within its boundaries. No more tickets, no more fines, no more harassment for street parking. A murmur of approval grew into applause. And 2, I paused, letting the moment hang in the air as I turned and looked directly at Brenda. Her face went pale. Brenda resigns as president of the Homeowners Association, effective immediately." The auditorium erupted. It was chaos. People were on their feet, shouting and applauding. The vast majority of my neighbors, the silent majority who had been cowed by Brenda's rule for years, had found their voice. A man from the back yelled, "I'll second that motion!" The reporter was scribbling furiously. Brenda looked at the faces in the crowd, at her neighbors who were now openly calling for her removal. She looked at her fellow board members, who were refusing to meet her gaze. There was nowhere for her to go. The community had spoken. Her reign was over. With a look of pure, venomous hatred directed at me, she stood up, gathered her papers, and without a word, stormed off the stage and out the side door of the auditorium. The room exploded in a standing ovation. Dave slapped me on the back, laughing. "You did it, you magnificent bastard! You actually did it!" The remaining board members, looking shell-shocked, held a hurried, whispered conference. The vice president, Gary, stepped to the podium. "The board, accepts Mr. Garcia's terms," he stammered. "The amendment will be drafted, and we accept Miss Johnson's resignation." The war was over. I had won. A week later, life on Maple Lane had returned to normal, but it was a new, better normal. The air felt lighter. Neighbors were smiling at each other. The oppressive sense of being constantly watched was gone. My 2 beautiful, official signs had been taken down and were now proudly mounted on the wall of my garage, like trophies from a hard-won war. The story had become a local legend. The news segment had been hilarious, painting me as a sort of folk hero of the suburbs. And the HOA, under its new, terrified leadership, had become a model of rationality. The amendment was passed, and a new era of not caring about legally parked cars had begun. That Friday evening, I was sitting on the curb in front of my house, the exact spot where this whole saga began. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood. Next to me, sharing a 6-pack of beer, was Sal the contractor. I'd called him up and told him the whole story. He'd insisted on coming by to celebrate. My truck was parked on the street right behind us. A few other cars were, too. It was a beautiful, harmonious, and slightly cluttered streetscape. Sal took a long pull from his beer bottle and looked around. "You're a legend, you know that?" he said, a grin on his face. "A suburban legend. The man who bought a road to fight his HOA. They'll be telling this story for years." I laughed, the sound genuine and relaxed. It was a matter of principle, you know? It just felt wrong. I couldn't let her get away with it. I took a sip of my own beer, the cold liquid a perfect punctuation to the end of a long, strange journey. I looked at the peaceful street, at the spot across the way where Brenda's minivan used to be parked. Rumor had it she was selling her house. "But I gotta admit," I said, turning to Sal with a wide grin, "it was also pretty damn fun." He clinked his bottle against mine. "To that," he said. I leaned back on my hands, looking up at the twilight sky. The peace and quiet, the freedom to park my own truck on my own street, The sweet, sweet taste of a victory won not with anger, but with absurdity. All of it had started with a single, ridiculous piece of paper. Best damn dollar I ever spent.